quoting it in a Pauline manner. Paul likes that language. Don't forget in Corinthians, when Paul lists the post-resurrection appearances of Christ, he speaks and he gives a kind of, we think there's a conflation going on in that text, because he speaks of first he appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, then he appeared, and it goes on like that. And then he starts a new section of that where he says, then he appeared to James, then he appeared to the other apostles. We've already mentioned the other apostles in the 12 when he was talking previously in that Corinthians passage. In any case, it finally ends up with, last of all, he appeared to me. I was last. I came when people least expected it, or when no one expected it. Paul is the last. You have to understand that when you get the first versus the last terminology in gospel allusions, it often has to do with the polemic against the righteous teacher type people. For instance, we were arguing the other day, or discussing, we were discussing Q, and you were showing me that parable where we have Jesus going into the wilderness and seeing 99 righteous ones in the wilderness and turns aside to rescue one sinner. That's paralleled in Galatians, where Paul says, you know, when the people turn away in the second page and go over to the messengers of James who come down from Jerusalem, and then Paul says, even though we are not Gentile sinners, and so on and so forth, the sinner language is often a leitmotif for Gentile. And to be in favor of the one sinner is often to be in favor of the whole Gentile movement, as opposed to the righteous ones like Qumran in the wilderness. This is kind of complex, I know, but you have to watch the polemics of the language that you have. So when you get a word in the Damascus document talking about the first, and so I know Jim Tabor likes to catalog what are the parallels here to Christian language, you have in this document, you're going to come on to the last. The last is us, living now in the last times, the last generation, when the last things are happening. And the first, they were the forefathers. They were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the others who gave the law. And later on in this text, you're going to have the first setting down the law, putting the boundary markers, and the new covenant comes to consolidate once again or reaffirm what the first did. But the liar, the spouter of lying, removes the boundary markers which the first set down. That is, which the Rishonim, or the ancestors and so on, set down. All this is implied by Ramesh's language, the forefathers here, but you just have to be very careful not to think it says forefathers in the Qumran scrolls. The language is the first versus the last. And the language of first versus the last in the scrolls is quite different than the New Testament. But the change in the New Testament is in a systematically recognizable kind. That is, once again, we are moving over into a different signification for the first versus the last. The last in the New Testament are people of the Pauline frame of mind, but they shall become first, and the righteous sort of snobbish folks who keep the law and think that they're more important and that they're more righteous and so on and so forth, or they were in the movement first, or the original apostles or others, the so-called arch apostles that Paul speaks about in the Corinthians correspondent. Not that their importance means anything to me, Paul says, etc. These are more like the first in the movement, and as Jesus says, they shall be last and the last shall be first, switching over to the Pauline scheme of things. That's how I see it anyway. So watch the language of the first shall be last. It's in Qumran, it's in the New Testament, but with entirely different signification. He left a remnant to Israel, that is, remembering the covenant of the first, and did not deliver it to be destroyed. Then we come to the age of wrath that we discussed last time, so we don't have to go in this, 390 years after he had given them over to the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. We are tracing Jewish history very quickly here. Notice how quickly we traced it. First we talk about the covenant of the first, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and maybe Moses. Then we're already to the Babylonian destruction. Then we're into 390 years. We've already discussed that the 390 probably has to do with the numerology of Daniel, and that the 390 years is probably not precise because these people did not have a calendarically precise sense of time, at least after the fall of the first temple. They probably had a better sense of time from the time of David down to the fall of the first temple because of the accurate records that they had than they had thereafter. So the 390 years is a real stumbling block for understanding this text, and it comes up right here because it makes people think that we are in 390 years after 600. That is, or 590 or 585, whenever you think you're giving the precise date of the fall of the temple. So take 390 from 585, and what do you get? About 195 or 200 or something like that. So people said, oh, we're coming into the Maccabean period here. And the whole interpretation of the scrolls has from that point on been the Maccabean period. There were psychological and other predispositions for it, but the whole interpretation of the scrolls has been the Maccabean period, largely because of the reference to 390, but very few people have really understood, and I'm not saying this out of self-interest or self-servingly, very few people have really understood that the 390 is not really understood accurately, but as a prophetical allusion. Now, there's another part of the 390, again, if you look at Ezekiel, who's a very important prophet to the writer of this text here, and as you see when we get into column 4, you'll see how important he is. 390 was the amount of time, as I said the other night, that Ezekiel's tongue clung to the roof of his mouth after he heard